Good morning, everybody. We're just going to give a couple of more minutes for people to still join us. If you are here for training on the Protection of Personal Information Act, you are in the right place. I'm going to give another 2 minutes or so. Right. Good morning, everybody. Today we are talking about the Protection of Personal Information Act and what it means for situations where you have to share personal information with someone outside of UCT. My name is Elizabeth de Stadler. I am the lead consultant on UCT's POPIA project, and I will be taking you through today's presentation. There is a lot of time at the end for questions, so I do want to encourage everybody to use the question and answer function. If you've got any questions, please post it there, and we will either answer it immediately if we know what the answer is, or we will answer it towards the end of today's session. Also keep an eye, even if you don't have questions, on the question and answer stream, because we will be posting useful links to resources for those of you who want more information or have more questions after today's session. We will also post links to where you can find today's slides, as well as the video of the recording in case you want to revisit it again. Right, so without too much further delay, let's talk about the Protection of Personal Information Act and what that means for sharing personal information with other people. I'm going to do a little bit of a recap of information that we dealt with in previous sessions. We have had 3 sessions so far. One was an introductory session. The other was around the implications of the Protection of Personal Information Act for research data. And the third was about all of the new rights that was created by POPIA, or POPIA, as some people pronounce it. Today, we're going to talk about sharing, but before we get there, for those of you who didn't attend the previous sessions or haven't listened to the videos, we're just going to recap some basics that will help you make sense of the material that we'll be covering today. So what is this legislation about? What does POPIA even stand for? And the all-important question of what is personal information and whose personal information does the university need and use on a day-to-day basis? Right, so first off, very important, the Protection of Personal Information Act, or POPIA as it is known, stands for personal information, and so it's very important to understand exactly what that is and what it isn't. And even before we get down to the nitty-gritty of today, if we misunderstand the scope of what is and is not considered personal information, we are going to open ourselves and the university up to risk. So let's revisit that very quickly. So the scope of this legislation is very, very broad. And the reason why I say that is because of the broad nature of the definition of personal information. So personal information is any information that I can relate back to an identifiable individual or an organization. POPIA is very unusual because it also protects the privacy of organizations, and there are only about 1 or 2 other countries in the world that does this. So the minute there is an identifiable individual or organization and you can relate information to them, you are likely in a position where you have to comply with this legislation. And personal information can include anything from as simple as your name and your ID number and sort of these basic identifiers, we call them, your student number, your staff number, through to information that is more related to your behavior. So anytime you're doing anything on your computer, it's more than likely that you are being tracked. So your behavior is being logged or monitored. And all of that information is also personal information of yours. Any information that you will find on a CV, so your background, your history, whether that is an educational history or a financial history, all of that is considered personal information. And then very, very important for today's purposes as well is often the information that we are working with is so-called demographic information. So information relating to a person's race, for instance, their ethnicity, what language they speak. Any information like that will also be considered personal information and is therefore protected by this legislation. So it's very important that we understand the scope of the information. So if you have any questions about what is and is not personal information, I am more than happy to answer those questions, and you can put them in the question and answer in the Q&A. Right, so once we get past what personal information is, we can also define the scope of the legislation by asking whose personal information do we tend to work with. Right? So we're in a university, so naturally our students are very important, what we call data subjects. So data subjects is the individual organization whose personal information is being used. And when we talk about students, we think about the whole life cycle of a student. So sometimes it starts very early. We might already be using personal information of prospective students, and that might include information relating to children or minors, so anybody under the age of 18, and that information is considered very, very sensitive. And we might be speaking to them about all of the options, and we might be speaking to them about enrolling with the university. Then once a student applies or a prospective student applies at the university, we gather a massive amount of information about them, and some of these applicants might go on to become students and some don't. And then there's all of the personal information that we gather and create and use while a student is a student at the university. And then lastly, once they graduate, they become alumni, and we use their personal information in order to maintain a relationship with them even after they leave the university. Similarly, we have a lot of information about employees, and employees or staff members also, that also has a bit of a life cycle, right? So we have people who are prospective employees or staff members who might apply for a job, or people who we might headhunt. And we have information about them, usually quite a lot of information that we need in order to decide whether we're going to hire them or not. Then during the life of an employment relationship, there is a massive amount of information, often very, very sensitive, that is gathered for sort of human resources purposes, as well as information that gets generated as the person goes about doing their job. And then lastly, staff members might leave us, they might resign, they might retire. And there's information that we maintain even after they have left the employ of the university. Then very importantly, and mustn't be overlooked, we have information relating to people who participate in research, the lifeblood of the university, where we generate massive amounts of often very valuable information relating to research. And that often when there are human research participants, or if other individuals are involved as stakeholders in research, there's massive amounts of information that gets collected, and that information is often also shared with others. So very relevant for today's topic. I mentioned this because there is also something called a POPIA Code of Conduct coming for research activities. The code will be circulated for comment fairly soon. And so if you are here with your research hat on, or if you are a researcher, that is definitely something to be on the lookout for. And I'm happy to answer any questions relating to the sharing of research data when it contains identifiable information about research participants. And then we also have affiliated organizations. So as I mentioned, POPIA applies also to organizations, and we have donors and funders and units and centers and companies in which the university is a shareholder. We have partner institutions, for instance, when we have exchange programs or we're doing research with other educational institutions, and we have service providers, suppliers, and independent contractors, much like myself, about whom we gather personal information so that we may have a relationship with each other, whether that is me providing services to the university or some other form of collaboration, and that information is also subject to the Act. And then lastly, we have other individuals. They're hard to put in the previous categories. It could be family members of students and employees, sureties, emergency contacts, visitors, and members of the public, and we gather information about them as well during the operation of the university. So what does it mean if something is personal information, or if we're talking about a relationship such as the ones that I just mentioned? Does that mean that we can't do anything with their personal information? Absolutely not. So POPIA is not rules-based. It's not a list of things that you are no longer allowed to do. It's principle-based legislation, which means that there is this balancing act that we have to do. And basically what the Act says at its core is that you can do whatever you need to do with personal information as long as the way in which you do it is reasonable. The word reasonable appears exactly 78 times in the legislation. And what that means is we're continuously balancing people's right to privacy, which is a human right and is also in our Bill of Rights in the Constitution, with an organization's right to go about its operations in an effective way. Right. So generally speaking, if you are doing something with personal information, whether it's of a student or a fellow employee or a service provider or a member of the public, you will be entitled to do what you need to do in order to get your job done. But there are certain principles that we have to follow to ensure that the university's right to operate in an efficient way is balanced against that person's right to privacy. And what that generally means is that we have to do as little as possible with personal information. So we need to do what we need to do to get our jobs done, but we need to make sure that we are doing it in a way that respects people's privacy. And nowhere is this balancing act more relevant than when we are talking about sharing personal information with other people. Now, there's a very human aspect to this when we talk about sharing. I'm going to quickly just remind you sort of where we are in terms of what sharing is. There's a lot of activities that we can perform with personal information, of which sharing is one. And for those of you who attended or listened to previous sessions, you will find this blue block familiar. On the outside there, those outside three layers, we have confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which are the cornerstones of information security. And for today's purposes, confidentiality is the important one. So what confidentiality is about is when we are using personal information, we need to make sure that only authorized people have access to it, right? It's confidential. That doesn't mean no one can access it. It means only people who have a reason to access the personal information should have access to it, right? So we're going to talk a lot about the fact that personal information is confidential. So just like you would treat other secrets, we need to keep personal information a secret. And it doesn't mean that you can never share it, but it means that you need to perform this little mental arithmetic or assessment before you decide to share personal information. And we're going to talk about when it is and is not appropriate. When we think about privacy in human terms, right? People get hypersensitive about their privacy when they learn that information is being shared between different organizations or with outsiders. And it's a very human thing. It's very similar to that feeling that you get when you know that people are gossiping about you. What is gossip? Gossip is people sharing often very personal information with each other about you and behind your back, right? So just like gossiping is bad, and by bad I mean more in the sense of it's not ethical, it's not the right thing to do. Sharing personal information without going through this assessment of figuring out whether it is allowable, whether it's justifiable in the context, is not just the wrong thing to do, but it also might get us into trouble from a POPIA perspective. So we're going to talk about not prohibiting sharing of personal information, but controlling it. And what does it mean to control sharing? Before I get to answer that question, I want to talk just a little bit about what I mean when I say sharing information. And I've listed some specific instances on today's on the slide that you're looking at right now. But in principle, there are two ways of sharing information. The one is active, in the sense that I have personal information and I'm going to transmit it to you. I'm either going to tell you if we are face-to-face, or if we're not face-to-face, I'm going to send it to you in some way. By far the most common or popular way of sharing personal information with other people is to send it via email. But email is the bane of my existence. When we talk about security compromises, which is when personal information is shared with an unauthorized person, right? So someone who does not have a reason to access that information, 9 times out of 10, what has happened is, let's say I have personal information that I need to share with a colleague or with someone outside of UCT. And let's say I have created a little spreadsheet, and for argument's sake, let's say this contains contact details, so nothing too sensitive, contact details of 100 students. And I've put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and I've attached it to an email. I would hazard a guess that there is not a single person on in this webinar today that has not accidentally sent an email to the wrong recipient. In a sense, email has become too user-friendly. We often start typing the recipient's email address and we hit enter when we are presented with the various options after we've hit 2 or 3 keys and we accidentally include too many people or the wrong people in the email. Right, and that is what is referred to as a security compromise. So if that Excel spreadsheet of 100 contact details of students or contact details of 100 students goes to the incorrect recipient, it is what POPIA refers to as a security compromise. The definition of that is when an unauthorized third party gets access to personal information, even if it is an accident. And what that means is that we now have to, as UCT, we have to write to the information regulator to say we had a security compromise, and we have to write to all 100 of the students whose privacy got compromised to say this happened, and we have to take steps in order to mitigate the harm, such as if it was an internal email, recalling that email, if it was external, getting an undertaking from the person who it went to in error that they won't share that information and that they have destroyed it. And that is a lot of, if nothing else, PT. You know, that creates a bit of a burden on the institution, but it also creates the potential for embarrassment, not just with the information regulator. If a security compromise is serious enough, the regulator can force the university to publish a press release to let the public know that there was a security compromise. And I think we can all agree that that is something that we would rather want to avoid. Just this week, we are dealing with an email that was sent to the wrong recipient. So this happens very often. So that's the one type of sharing, is where we transmit information. And we're going to talk in a moment about alternatives, safer alternatives to email when we transmit large batches of personal information. The other way to share personal information is to give access to the information where it is, as the IT specialist would say, at rest. That happens when, let's say, we are storing personal information in a file or in a specific system, and someone needs access to it. And instead of sending it to them, we create a login and a password for them so that they can access the information in that system or in that file, or get access to that file. That is inherently a more secure way of doing it, because just like I can give access, I can just as easily normally revoke access to that information. But this is also sharing. So let's talk in the context of research. Again, this is an actual example that we are looking at this week at UCT. We have research data that is being stored by UCT, and we are giving access to that research data to, amongst other people, individuals who work for the funder. They are located in America. What that means is we are sharing information across borders. And the information is not leaving UCT systems, but because we gave that person access, that constitutes sharing. And is relevant for today's webinar, right? There's not necessarily a problem here. The person who we're sharing the information with is under a confidentiality undertaking, and the information is protected, but it is sharing. So we have to do this little balancing exercise that I was talking about earlier So it's very important to understand all of these different ways of sharing personal information. Right. So now that we know what sharing is, what do we have to think about? So there is a data privacy policy that the university approved now in almost, I think, a year ago. And what does this policy say about sharing personal information? It says that when we share, there are two very important things that need to happen. First off, we need to maintain a record of what information we share with who. In other words, we need to identify sharing when it happens. And the second thing that we have to do is we need to make sure that if we are sharing personal information with an external organization or external individual, that they will also protect that information, because we stay responsible for that information. And how do we make sure that they will protect that information? Well, mostly that happens by ensuring that we have concluded the right contracts with them. And what do these contracts normally say? Well, normally it says what personal information we're sharing, why we are sharing it, that they're not allowed to use it for any other purpose apart from the reason for why we shared it with them, that they will keep this information confidential, and that they will protect its security, and that if they have a security compromise, so if they accidentally or on purpose, or it might sometimes be malicious, if that information gets out there and there's unauthorized access on their side, that they will let us know that it has happened, because we are still responsible as UCT when we share personal information with other people. And it means in many cases, if there is a security compromise on the other side of the person who we shared that information with, we still have to notify the information regulator, and we might need to take steps to mitigate the harm, right? That's a hell of a lot of responsibility. Sit with that for a second. If we share personal information with an external organization or individual, 9 times out of 10, we are still responsible for that information, even though we don't have control over that external organization or individual. So how do we solve this? Well, we get control by concluding appropriate contracts with them in which they make certain undertakings. Right, so that is a big ask. We normally find that this is the hardest part of any data privacy policy to comply with, is getting control over who we share personal information with, and then making sure that we maintain some control over what they do with that personal information once we have shared it. Okay, so let's break this down into some more practical guidance or guidelines, and we will make a recording of today's session available, as well as these slides, because I do realize that they are a little bit text heavy, but I wanted to give you more information than maybe we do normally. Right, so what we've done is we've created a little image of this balancing act that I'm talking about around deciding when to share information. Right, so the first question that you ask yourself is, if someone has asked you to share information, who is asking? Is it someone inside UCT, in other words, another staff member or a student, for instance, or is it someone outside of the organization? So let's deal with internal sharing first. Right, so the person who is asking is a person with a UCT email address. That's usually a good indication that they are internal. Right, now, the first question that you ask is, do they need this information in order to do their job? If the answer is no, then we probably shouldn't be sharing that information with them. And this is called access control, right? So access control principles have to do with sharing as little personal information as possible with as few as possible people. And the reason why we do that is every person that has hands-on personal information represents a risk. 80% of incidents relating to personal information is caused by human error. So the fewer people have access to the less personal information. So fewer people and less personal information, the better, because it means that we are maintaining better control. But now let's say the person does need this information to do their job. If they need it, but they don't have access, give them access or arrange access for them without emailing them the information, because as I said, email often goes astray. It goes to the wrong person. So if they need access to the information, rather give them access to the place where the information is stored, so the system or the file. Right, so if the answer is yes, we can arrange access for them, then we should. If the answer is no, but they still need that information to do their jobs. Now, maybe you may be faced with a situation where you do have to email it to them because that's the only option, but then make very sure that you are emailing it to the right person. Then on the other side, if we are sharing it with someone outside of a UCT, then you need to ask yourself, is this the type of request for personal information by external people that you normally deal with? If the answer is no, this is very unusual. You should rather ask either senior management in your area or the POPIA hotline whether you are entitled to share this information with an external organization or individual, right? So rather check. Because as I said, if the answer is no, you're not supposed to share the information, but you do, we have just created a security compromise. If dealing with these types of requests for access to information, personal information, is part of your day-to-day, and there will be many of you who do this on a daily basis, you need to think, is there an approved sort of process by which we determine whether I should share this information or not? So either the process of establishing whether this person's entitled to this information has been already approved by senior management, or they're approving it on an ad hoc basis. But if you are not sure whether you should be sharing this information, in other words, it's not routinely part of your job, again, rather ask whether you are entitled to share this information. And I'm going to talk you through what should go into that assessment of whether you should share. But if you are sharing this information routinely, it's part of your job, there's a process that you follow. We don't want to disrupt these processes that have always been followed. But what we do then need to look at is, even if you've always shared this information, you've always shared it in this way, is this the way in which you share it secure? And I'm going to give you some tips there. But if it is unusual or out of the ordinary, or you are not sure whether you are authorized to share, rather check. And you can do that either by checking in with more senior management or your line manager, or you can, if you are unsure, you can email the POPIA hotline, and I'll give you that email address towards the end of the presentation. Right, so unless it is in your job description, don't share personal or confidential information with third parties without checking certain things, right? So one of the things that we will check is that appropriate contracts are in place. If you are not sure whether a contract is in place, you need to find out and err on the side of caution. So find out more about who you're sharing with, and whether UCT has got an established relationship with them, and whether the contract with them addresses things like confidentiality. Because personal information, and that is one of the biggest changes that came in about a year ago when POPIA became effective, is that personal information is now considered inherently confidential. So we need to make sure that we maintain control over what it is used for and who it's disclosed to. Right. Also, once you've established that you must share the information, don't overshare. So always share as little personal information as possible. I will illustrate this with an example. So a couple of years ago, it did not, as far as I know, happen at UCT, but this happened at another university. There was a scam going on where people were trying to get, and by people, I mean identity thieves, were targeting universities in order to get personal information about students. And they were doing this by calling the university and pretending that they are the student and saying, can you send me confirmation that I studied there and that I attained a degree? But they did not necessarily, they weren't the student, they were pretending to be the student. And what many of the universities fell prey to is then to send them academic transcripts or a lot of information that this identity thief did not want. If someone asks a question like, confirm whether I graduated at UCT, that's a yes/no question. But some of the universities would send letters that contained ID numbers and student numbers and exactly when the person graduated, and even some academic results. And that makes it just a little bit easier for this identity thief to impersonate this person and do things like open accounts in their name, etc. So we need to make sure that we only share the information that is absolutely necessary for whatever purpose we are sharing it, right? So once we've established that we should be sharing the information. Also be very careful, and all I'm asking is that a little red flag goes up if you are going to share large batches of personal or confidential institutional information by email. Email is one of the least secure ways to share information. So there are two reasons for this. Firstly, because emails often go to the wrong person, but also it means that that information is sitting in your inbox, in your out tray, and if someone hacks your email, they get access to it. So consider alternative ways of sharing, like giving people rather access to the information in the cloud, or other, sanctioned ways to give information. But if you regularly share large batches of email and large batches of personal information using email, reach out to IT services and inquire about more secure ways to transfer that information, because there are also other technical ways like secure file transfer protocols, which you could use to share that information. Then always use your UCT email when you are doing your work, and that has to do more with records management than anything, but it means that we have more control over email and where it goes, and we could even potentially recall email if it's only UCT email addresses involved. So please shy away from using your personal Gmail, and similarly shy away from using your personal Dropbox accounts or personal Google accounts, anything like that. So when you are using UCT sanctioned emails, UCT sanctioned cloud service providers, it makes it so much easier for us to control who the email is, who the personal information is shared with, but also if something does go wrong, we've just got that little bit more control over revoking access or revoking that email. You also need to double check that you're sending the email to the right person, or asking the recipient to confirm that they received the email. If you are emailing a large group of recipients, always use blind copy, so BCC, rather than CCing them. One of the other universities recently got hauled over the coals in the media because they were sending an email to 3,000 employees, and instead of BCCing everyone, they CC'd them, thereby disclosing their email addresses to all other 3,000 people. That is a security compromise in and of itself. So always use BCC when you are sending group emails. Always, if you do have to use email, include the personal information in a password protected attachment rather than in the body of the email, and then send the password via an alternative means such as an SMS. And if you are going to use email, also check whether it is Google or Outlook, whether you can use confidential mode, or whether you're making use of all of the settings that allows you to revoke email. So for instance, on Outlook, there is now a setting that you can activate where it delays the sending of the email by 20 seconds, which means that if you happen to accidentally send it to the wrong recipient, you can still, if you notice it immediately, you can still stop the sending of that email. So just investigate the settings of your email accounts. When you are sharing through the cloud, again, don't use personal cloud accounts, always use the institutional cloud accounts, and the preference at UCT is SharePoint, but there are also other cloud services that you can use, but always make sure that you shy away from using personal accounts. It is just about control, and it gives us more protection if something goes wrong. If you are using social media, and I realize during COVID this became a bit of a habit, and because we had to find all kinds of different ways to stay in contact. The most common one is WhatsApp, and if it is not a UCT WhatsApp account, please make sure that you keep a record of your interactions and communications. Again, this is for your own protection, but it is also if we end up in a situation where we have to prove who got access to what, we need a record of what was shared. So do make sure that your WhatsApp conversations, for instance, are backed up. But again, it's always better to use university sanctioned communication methods, because that then automatically gives us access to and excuse me, helps us to keep a record of the communication. Right, so I'm hoping to get to your questions now. This is a very important email address. I realize that this can be quite a scary topic to talk about. What we are asking of you is to be careful when you share personal information, particularly when you're sharing personal information with outsiders, so individuals or organizations outside of the UCT fold. If you are unsure about what to share and how to share, or if you have any questions that don't occur to you today, this POPI email address is manned by us, and we are more than happy to answer your questions. But if you have questions that you want to ask today, now is the time. I'm going to look at the Q&A. It is loading, so please just bear with me. Right. Is there a generic statement we can use for external suppliers using our systems, for instance, social media and student records? So we can provide you with a statement, but I'm going to say use it with caution. So when people have access to our systems, they should be external people, they should be signing a contract in which they at least undertake that they will keep the information confidential, and that they won't use the personal information for any purposes other than the purpose for which it was shared, and that they should ask for permission if they want to share it on with anybody else. So those kinds of statements we can make, but it is often not binding if it's only provided at the bottom of an email or in a notice in a system. So there should be a contract that is concluded by them or something that they accept. So what that statement says, as I said now, is basically that they must keep any information that they have access to confidential, that they mustn't share it with anybody else without the university's permission, and that they mustn't use the information for any purpose other than the purpose for which it was shared with them. So that kind of statement will help already. But preferably they should accept that as part of sort of the terms of their access to that system, or in terms of a contract with the organization that they represent. What about sharing research reports with external examiners for examination? We do add a clause that the entire process is confidential. Yes, so POPI will care about the publication of research findings or research data where that data is still identifiable. Ordinarily, for external examination purposes, the personal information of the research participants will no longer be identifiable. We generally speaking would publish findings. Of course, with UCT's open access policy, when we publish findings, we are also encouraged to publish the research data. Even then, that research data will often be anonymous, or at the very least pseudonymized. In other words, it won't be possible for people who view that research data necessarily to identify research participants. As I mentioned, there is also a code of conduct coming that will also address the publication of potentially identifiable research data. But as I said, when we share with examiners, what they will often have access to is the personal information of the person being examined, but not necessarily research participants. So from a POPI perspective, I'm not so worried about it. From an intellectual property perspective, that confidentiality statement is important. Very often when research is conducted using university infrastructure, the intellectual property that is generated, specifically if that intellectual property is potentially valuable for commercial purposes, belongs to the university. And so we must protect the confidentiality of it in the event that the university, along with the IP creators, want to commercialize that. And so if trade secrets and patents and things like that get out in the open, that obviously is not good for the university. So that's the primary reason why findings like that would be confidential. Is it considered a security compromise if the information is not identifiable? No. So in order for it to be a security compromise, the person needs to be able to link that information to an identifiable person. But we have to be very careful, because sometimes, let's say the information is, there's no name or necessarily an ID number. Sometimes if that information can be linked by using, for instance, publicly available information to an individual, POPI would still apply and it might still be a security compromise, right? So what you need to think about is, even if that information is not readily identifiable, are there methods by which that information can become identifiable? In other instances, the information might be identifiable because of the context. So, for instance, if the information relates to a small group of people, the context might render the individual to whom the specific information relates identifiable. So we need to be very, very careful when we think about, is this information identifiable? It's not just, is it directly identifiable, but also, are there indirect methods through which the person can become identified? In which case, it might still be in a security compromise, but that is a very good question. Does UCT have standardized contracts and agreements that can be used? Yes, we do. There is a contract playbook that contains standard clauses that we use both to conclude new contracts and to negotiate old ones. This is available through UCT's legal services, and we certainly try and standardize this as far as possible, and you are more than welcome to request assistance if you need to conclude a contract with the right clauses in. You can do that, as I said, either by contacting legal services or by using the POPI email address that I showed you on your screens, or is currently displayed on your screen. Right, then I do want to, for those of you who are not necessarily monitoring the Q&A, as we go through the questions, there is a POPI information guide. This is also where we publish in FAQs and things like this information session, the videos and the slides. And the link has been posted in the Q&A section, so please take that down. Or otherwise, if you need access to it in future, you can just email the POPI hotline and we will give you access. We send research reports through email. So as I said, I don't want to say never ever use email to disseminate or send personal information around, because sometimes that's the only alternative. But it will always be better to rather send people a link to a file that is hosted somewhere, because you can revoke that access. You can also, with most cloud platforms, you can restrict the copying or exporting of that information. So it just gives us more control. If you do have to use email, password protect attachments, specifically if it contains very sensitive personal information or large volumes of personal information, and send the password through another channels, for instance, an SMS. Don't put the password in the body of the email to which the file is attached, because if that email is intercepted or sent to the incorrect recipient, then the password is not worth all that much. So those are some mechanisms that can make email safer, and it's not always possible. So all I'm asking is, if you're about to attach personal information to an email, make 100% sure that you're sending it to the right recipient. As I said, on a near weekly basis, we are dealing with security compromises caused by email being sent accidentally to the wrong person, and that causes a lot of admin headaches. So just be very, very careful. Also, when someone has requested personal information from you and they've asked you to share it with them via email, make sure that the recipient is who you think they are. So look at things like whether the email address they gave you matches the institution that they said they are from, things like that. So just be hyper vigilant. If you are unsure, rather check whether you are entitled to share this information. Okay. Then we have a message here to say about the Ziva Hub Quick Guide on Open and Close Collaboration, which is run on Figshare. And this is a trusted digital technology or platform that you can use to share research data. So again, if you are sharing massive amounts of information, and if that is research data, this is a good example of a university-sanctioned sharing method. So always inquire. And here we're not talking about the sort of ad hoc sharing that happens from individual to individual with relatively small volumes of information. When you are sharing large volumes of personal information and you're doing that regularly as part of your job or the activity that you are embarking on, so research, for instance, always inquire about what are the university-sanctioned sharing methodologies and and platforms, of which the Ziva Hub and Figshare is an example, right? So always inquire. Check yourself before you wreck yourself is the short answer here. So always just check. And there's some very useful information that has been put in the Q&A for those researchers who want to share information. Then we've got a comment here. While I prefer BCC, surely open CCing inside an organization is not a breach. So in the example that I mentioned, what had happened was some emails were internal emails, so were emails relating that were issued by the university itself, and other emails were personal emails. While you are correct that sharing internally is not necessarily a security compromise, because your UCT email addresses are published internally, and just be careful, because often when you are sending group email, particularly if it's system generated, there might be some personal Gmail or other emails mixed up in there, and that could be a breach. But yes, in principle, disclosing your UCT email address to UCT staff members, there is a directory for that, and that is not considered a breach, because you can access it through the address book. Can we make sure that our contracts department insists on including this sort of thing in the contracts with funders and collaborators? Yes. So the project has in the past worked quite closely with the research contract team, as well as the legal services teams, in order to make sure that these templates are used, and that these clauses are included in those contracts. If we have not spoken to your specific contract team, we are available to have a session with them. When the ASAF POPI Code of Conduct for research-related processing comes out, we will engage with those teams again in order to ensure that we also put provisions in the contracts that refer to the code. At the moment, that's a bit premature, as the code is still being developed and circulating for comment. But if you notice that your team is not taking confidentiality and data protection into account when negotiating contracts with collaborators and funders, please be in touch, and we are more than happy to provide them with information and information sessions, as we have in the past. Then the primary purpose of UCT's open data repository is to enable yourself and your collaborators to openly publish your research outputs, exactly, making them findable and citable as fair, compliant, scholarly data. So that is the foundations of open access principles. As I said, often, or more often than not, this information is not identifiable, and so open access and privacy concerns are not always in conflict. It can happen from time to time that information is that you're asked to share research data in a more identifiable format, in which case it's often then protected behind a so-called DAC, so a data access committee, who will determine or make sure that that information is only used for further research purposes, and we will then evaluate whether the request for access to that information is legitimate. POPI does nothing to limit open access to research data that is fully de-identified or only statistical. And there are also a lot of settings that you can use within the open access platform in order to make sure that the information is shared securely. So I do encourage you to take a look at the resources that have been posted in the Q&A. Okay, I'm just checking whether there are any other questions that I might have missed, but it doesn't look like it. I'm going to give you another couple of minutes in order to post your questions. But so just to summarize, while we make sure that there are no unanswered questions left, please make sure that if you are unsure whether you can share information with this external organization or external party, make sure that there is a contract in place that protects the confidentiality of any personal information. Even if there is a contract in place, always make sure that you use the most secure method to share that information. Try and avoid sending large batches or very sensitive personal information via email. You are always welcome to contact the POPI hotline if you are unsure about any of this. And you can also contact IT if you want to inquire about secure file transfer protocols or methods that are already available. But as I said, you can also send those requests through the POPI hotline, and we will direct it to the right place. But above all, just be hyper vigilant when you share personal information. And if you are unsure, rather check than take the chance. It's usually very quick just for us to evaluate what's going on and to make sure that the right safety measures are in place. Okay, and with that, it doesn't look like there are any more questions. I'm going to conclude today's session. I want to thank you for attending and thank you for your interest, and please reach out if we can be of any assistance.
Sorry, there are a few more questions.
Where are they?
Publishing them.
Oh, there we go. I am not sure about the answer to the question. I find the ZVibe chat a bit spammish and am hesitant to click on the links. Is there a UCT website link instead? I'm not sure if our colleagues from, I think it was from the library, can answer that question. I'd be very grateful. When a courier company transports tests to and from institutions, who is responsible for the loss of information should their truck be hijacked or the papers go missing? So that is a very good question. Often there will be terms and conditions with a courier company that we concluded when we decided to use them. They will take some responsibility, but for the safety of that information. But the information regulator, if that information is compromised, that they are transporting, will primarily use UCT, hold UCT responsible, and then UCT will pass that responsibility onto the courier company. But for the information regulators' purposes, they will look at the company that instructed the courier company, and that's why it's so important that we use trustworthy services and that we make sure that we have the right contracts in place. You can't BCC meeting invitations, so this means that you can't send a meeting or invitation to multiple people outside of UCT. I will be the first to admit that I am not, the oracle on what functionality we can and can't use. I know that we are able to blind copy outsiders when we send invitations. So that is perhaps just worth checking out with IDS, whether that is possible. That will depend on your internal settings. And then thank you for saying thank you for the sessions. I'm very glad that they are very helpful. Does UCT have a template of questions that can be used screening callers, especially those who request personal information via phone calls? I am not aware whether we have that available. I don't think so. If anybody on the call knows otherwise, but I think that is a very good suggestion, and we will include it on our list of things to investigate. A standard questionnaire of assessing whether a person is who they say they are. Very often, if you've got personal information on the person, a very easy way is to ask them to confirm an email address or a cell phone number, much like what happens when you are phoning a bank, for instance, and they'll often ask you questions around your birth date or your ID number in order to make sure that you are who you say you are. If you are sharing personal information and you've got someone who is on the phone, your best bet is also just to have a very careful look at the email address itself and whether it matches what you have on your system and whether it matches where the person said they were from, because sometimes these emails are spoofed. So you need to just keep a careful eye on the domain that is used, and quite often, if it is suspicious, it is because there is something wrong with it. Okay, there is some more information around from library services just around research data management. So for those of you who are interested, please just take down these email addresses from the chat. But we will make everything available as well on the POPI information site. Veronica, is that it? Are they still coming in?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for attending. Please feel free to access the recordings as well as the slides, and again, a reminder, if you have any doubts whatsoever, please feel free to contact the POPI hotline, and we are more than happy to help out and give advice. Thank you.